dye was rare, and purple fabric was worth its weight in silver. Franchises for dealing in purple were highly coveted. So here's Lydia at the river praying. A woman of considerable means. She also had a large house. For at the conclusion of this short story in the Bible, she invites Paul and his 3 traveling evangelist friends to stay with her at her house. What makes this impressive is that Lydia had many in her house, probably many servants as well as children, if she had children. Lydia seems to be the head of the household. No husband is mentioned. Perhaps she was a widow. We simply don't know. There could even have been an extended family in her household. So, to house the 4 traveling evangelists, in addition to the rest of her household and servants, indicates that Lydia's house was very large for that time. It's important to note that Lydia was not a Jewish woman. She was a Gentile, and she did worship God. As Lydia listened to Paul's message about Jesus that day, Luke tells us that the Lord opened her heart to the message of Jesus, and she believed in Jesus as Messiah. And so she asked Paul, "Would you baptize me and my whole household?" And they did. And then she said, "If you have found me to be a worthy servant of the Lord, would you stay at my home?" And to that gracious invitation, Paul and his fellows accepted. So many things came out of that experience. Lydia was the first convert to be a follower of Jesus in Europe. The very first one in Europe. It's quite an amazing story. And I ask you, was that providence or was it coincidence? If you had asked Lydia, do you just happen to be there when the Apostle Paul came down to the river to pray? How do you think she might have answered? God's hand or chance? Obviously, you can make a case either way, but I think Lydia would have said, it was God's providence. God brought me to that spot just so I could hear the gospel. I think Lydia would say that her encounter with Paul was providence because Lydia was already a person of faith before this. It's an important distinction. There's a tendency on the part of some religious people to divide the world into saved and unsaved. If you're not in my church, you're unsaved, kind of thing. And you may, if you're righteous, you're in my church. If you're not, you're unrighteous. If you're not a baptized believer in some people's eyes, then you are somehow inferior, unacceptable, probably immoral. And they might say such persons are welcome in their church, but you got to remember, they're a different class. However, the New Testament does not make such distinctions. In the New Testament, there are Jews and there are Christians and there are people who are referred to as God-fearers. Lydia fits the description of a God-fearer. Luke refers to Lydia simply as a worshiper of God. Today we might call her a seeker, someone who is outside the traditional faith community, but is seeking to know God. She was a Gentile, and she was a worshiper of God, seeking after God. So it was no accident that she was down by the river to pray when she encountered the Apostle Paul. Lydia was hungry for God. Our land today is filled with hungry people like Lydia. Many of them are fine, decent people, particularly young people in our society who are seeking God. They have little or no church background. they might describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. Have you heard that one? Maybe at work. They may have been turned off by the church at some time in the past. They may have been hurt by the church, but they hunger for God. They want values, solid, life-changing values. They want something they can depend on as they go through life. And we as followers of Jesus need to reach out to them. We need to encounter them where they are and share genuinely and generously what God has done in our life, like Tim just did. Dr. Kubler-Ross tells a story about a woman she encountered when she was writing her famous book on death and dying. Part of Dr. Kubler-Ross's research involved going to patients who were dying in the hospital where she served and asking them about what were their feelings, what were their thoughts about death as they faced it. And as she went into various rooms of people who were dying, she noticed a very interesting pattern. Sometimes she would go into a person's room who was dying, and yet the person would be calm, at peace, and tranquil. And she began to notice that this was often after that person's room had been cleaned by a certain woman orderly. One day she happened to meet that orderly in the hall, and the doctor asked her, "What are you doing with my patients?" And the lady thought, "Oh boy, I'm being read out here." And so she said rather defensively, "I'm not doing anything with your patients." And the doctor said, no, it's a good thing. After you go into their rooms, they seem to be at peace. What are you doing with my patients? The orderly said, "I just talk to them. You know, I've had 2 babes of my own die on my lap. But God never abandoned me." I tell them that. I tell them that they aren't alone, that God is with them, that they don't have to be afraid. Imagine if you were a patient in that hospital, and maybe at a low point, and this lady comes to clean your room, and as she does, she listens to your concerns, and then she tells you her story, and she gives you hope that maybe you didn't have. When you're just praying with my friends, and God sent me a messenger, a man named Paul, and God changed my life. Have you read the letter of Paul to the Philippians recently? Not recently. Have your grandma read it to you. It's really good. Right in the first few verses, it says, "I thank my God for all of you every time I think of you." They were so generous. They continued to support Paul no matter where he was, whether he was traveling, whether he was in prison, no matter where he was, they were at the front of hospitality and sharing and caring, and they were so generous. Because of Lydia.